Friends, it's a privilege to be here today at the Indian History Congress, and I would like to thank my colleagues in the History Congress for having elected me as the President of the Modern India section here. The issue of responsibility was also taken up, and one point that I would like to flag off right in the beginning is that when the Congress and Gandhi accepted partition, they were doing so only as a temporary measure. In fact, Gandhi said, "Don't accept it in your hearts, India will become one." That was the hope. The double tragedy was, as we know, that partition became a reality, an irreversible reality, not just something temporary as hoped by the national movement. And the double blow was delivered, that is, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu communalist who felt that Gandhi was appeasing Muslims and continued to do so even in the post-independent state. In my book, Independence and Partition, I have offered an alternative explanation of why the British quit India. And I have argued there that the answers to why partition or why independence are not to be found in 1947 or indeed in 1946. These answers are best located in the long years of mass struggle against colonial rule. By 1945, when the war was over, the only issue left was to whom and how power was to be transferred. By the end of the Second World War, I have shown in my book, the national movement had established very substantively its hegemony over large sections of the Indian people. National sentiment was a high pitch. It had reached sections of society and areas, and this is very important, which were hitherto outside the pale. I refer here to the armed forces, to the civil services, all of whom were also weary from wartime service and from handling nationalist protest. So colonial officials, as well as ordinary people, realized that the authority of the colonial power had suffered an irreversible decline. The strategy that had been followed by the Congress, the main nationalist party, to effect this erosion of colonial power has been termed by Bipin Chandra as struggle through struggle. I would just, as an aside, like to add that this framework was first presented by Bipin in his presidential address to the Indian History Congress at Amritsar in 1985. I think that is a matter of some interest to us here today. STS, as Bipin called it, was a strategy in which phases of struggle were followed by phases of truce, which in turn paved the way for the next round of struggle in an upward moving spiral. That is, repression of non-violent movements exposed the naked power behind the government. On the other hand, when the government went in for a truce, it was perceived as too weak. While loyalist groups underwent a crisis of confidence or a crisis of faith in the government, the dilemma of the services, the civil services, the ICS, the much vaunted steel frame of the Raj, was one of action. What do they do? The same set of officials found it very demoralizing to implement both poles of policy, repression and conciliation, and they made it very clear to the government of the day that this was impossible for them to handle. What do you do? How do you put Pandit Govind Ballabh Pant in jail when he has just been the Chief Minister of the United Provinces and you have served as the Chief Secretary? A very difficult dilemma indeed. From the mid-1980s, partition came to replace independence as the main focus of scholarship. A book that came up and created a bit of a sensation in this respect was Ayesha Jalal's The Sole Spokesman, where she made this very provocative statement that Jinnah did not want partition, Congress wanted it. Jalal would have it that Jinnah only used the demand for Pakistan as a bargaining lever to get a share of power at the center. It's not surprising that this book was picked up enthusiastically in India, where there was a ready soil of anti-Congressism, which had become cemented in the post-emergency years. A.G. Nurani and H.M. Sirvai, among others, ably argued Jalal's brief. It's also not surprising that readers in Pakistan were not enthused by Jalal's book at all, because her thesis was that the most striking fact, I quote a sentence from her, she says, the most striking fact about Pakistan, Jalal writes, is how it failed to satisfy the interests of the very Muslims who are supposed to have demanded its creation. So there was quite a furor in Pakistan that she was denying the very legitimacy of the creation of Pakistan as it was seen. But as I said, no lack of anti-Congressism in India, which lapped up this book very eagerly. Jalal's argument was that Congress and the Hindu Mahasabha refused to share power with the Muslim League, and they preferred to let Muslim majority provinces of Punjab and Bengal go out of India. So the argument goes on, the Congress demand for division of the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, she concludes, shows that the Congress was in favor of partition. In this, she is equating the partition of the country with the partition of the provinces, something which is very surprising for a serious historian like her. In fact, many years ago, I had called this an intellectual sleight of hand. She quotes Nehru's statement to Mountbatten, saying, Mr. Jinnah was much opposed to partition. But she very conveniently forgets to mention that the partition of Punjab was being discussed by Nehru, not that of the country. Jalal ignores the distinction that Congress was committed to the unity of the country and reluctantly supported the demand of the minorities of Punjab and Bengal, that is the Hindus and the Sikhs, for a division of the province. And why did they demand this? They demanded this in the event of, I'm underlining the word, in the event of the partition of the country. By placing responsibility for partition on the Congress, she absolves the British. Congress initiated it at the center. It was responded to by Bengali Hindus at the provincial end. Again, let me point out to you the use of the category Bengali Hindus. This is completely, I think, an erroneous category. She not only uses it, the word Bhadralok, she talks about the Bengali Hindu coalition, she uses the word Hindu alliance, and to my mind this suggests a much greater convergence between Congress and Hindu Mahasabha in Bengal that there was at the ground level. At best, the political stances of the Congress and the Mahasabha in Bengal intersected at certain moments. That is, in the last few months of colonial rule, but before that there was a complete difference between the two of them. Right. Jalal, when she talks about the 3rd June plan, she talks about how the 3rd June 1947 plan, which we also know as the Mountbatten Award, was because of the success of the Bengali Hindu coalition, which had designed, I'm using her words, designed partition in order to restore their privileges and deliver them, that is the Hindus, from the tyranny of a Muslim majority. I fail to understand how an award by the British, known as that, can be designed by the Congress. The Congress supposedly wanted partition to get rid of the troublesome Muslim community. Furthermore, the Congress leaders, we are told, were in a hurry to achieve power. The party was also responsible, we are told, for the massacres that ensued. To quote Anderson, quote, "The avidity of Congress for the prize money of an instant division was the local motive of the disaster," unquote. Very similar to Chatterjee's, the prize money, you will remember, similar to spoils of partition. British responsibility for massacres is conveniently negated. That's something I'd like to draw your attention to. The inversion of the characterization, that is, now Congress is communal, League is secular. Congress is for partition, Muslim League is not for partition. This inversion performs an important function. It denies the legitimacy of the secular nationalist anti-colonial movement and provides ammunition to the imperialist school position that India was gifted self-government by the British, and that partition was the unavoidable consequence of primordial Hindu-Muslim enmity. So, British policy of divide and rule is elided. For the anti-modernists, even secularism is a Western alien concept that has been imposed by the modernists, by the children of Macaulay. The phrase used by the right-wing Hindu communalists for the secular liberal intelligentsia would be the somewhat uglier term. I have refrained from translating it for that reason, for precisely what the anti-modernists mean. When we come to the last decade of colonial rule, Anderson picks up moments from 1942 to 1946 to show up how Congress is the main stumbling block to unity. Nehru again here is painted as the villain of the piece, who stymied the cabinet mission plan and paved the way for partition. Here again, Anderson does not divert from the imperialist school. I would argue that Nehru's stand here is very much misrepresented. Nehru's statement, "We are not bound by a single thing except that we have decided to go into the Constituent Assembly." This was no different from Gandhi's comment 2 weeks earlier in the Harijan of 26th May, where Gandhi said, "The Constituent Assembly will decide its own procedure. The mission plan is not binding." But very curiously, nobody has picked up Gandhi to lamb. It is Nehru who is the villain of the piece, not just in Anderson, but starting from Maulana Azad downwards. The primary cause for Indian independence, according to him, was the hammer blow from outside, delivered by the Japanese army in the Second World War. Curiously, he declares all Gandhian-led mass movements, especially 1942, to be what he calls a monumental failure. This is very much in line with the conservative imperialist argument, which we know does not concede any role to the Indian national movement. And this is something, and an alternative explanation which brings in the role of the national movement was something that I had begun my address with. The Congress leaders made it a point to consult Gandhi on important political matters. Traveling to where Gandhi was, Nehru visited Noakhali for the purpose, and I can give many examples of this. What's curious about this argument is that Gandhi, who was in the dock so far for having Hinduized the Congress and the national movement, where if we go back to RPD, he was the bourgeois mascot of Indian nationalism, who had pulled the reins on the masses, etc. Sumit Sarkar, EMS talks about that how it's very strange that the very Gandhi who is denigrated for his role in the movement, in his old age and particularly in his last days, he suddenly becomes a messiah. And EMS in the Mahatma and the ism wrote about the Mahatma's finest hour. Sumit Sarkar picked up that phrase and wrote a whole passage in Modern India on this. And of course, it's very clear that what is behind this about turn, if we can call it that, is, or forgetfulness, is very clearly the fact that, now it is assumed that Gandhi is no longer with the Congress. So this argument is very important to prove that Gandhi was isolated from the Congress. The Congress leaders are tired, hungry for power, but Gandhi is now the old man who is, as I said, the Messiah. Anderson says, Gandhi, who had made it a mass force, it became, called at independence for its dissolution. He was right. This is a familiar tack shared by scholars of diverse persuasions. The Rudolphs who have written on Gandhi have referred to this. Rajmohan Gandhi in Good Boatman has written about this. Again, this is a view which does not hold water at all if we look at the documents. In a note just 3 days before he died, 27 January 1948, Gandhi wrote, he said, "The Congress has outlived its use in its present form. It should be disbanded and flower into a Lok Sevak Sangh." This appeared as an article in Harijan titled, "His Last Will and Testament." What is important to note here, friends, is that this was a phrase not used by Gandhi, last will and testament. It was something which was added by his associates. This title and the posthumous publication of this note gave it a certain significance which was much greater than what the Mahatma intended. All that Gandhi was doing was penning a draft constitution. In fact, he had penned many draft constitutions of the Congress right from 1946, when Divakar had gone to the Congress secretary to Noakhali. It was perhaps, if Gandhi had lived maybe to 125 years as he intended to live, it is possible that this, what he wrote on this day, would have been debated in the Congress. It would not, this part of it, which was on disbanding the party, the small section, would not have been taken out of context and made into a last will and testament. Also, surprisingly, in the same Harijan, that is in the Harijan of 2nd February 1948, where this is published, there is another piece by Gandhi, which is very conveniently ignored and which I think should be read along with his so-called last will and testament, where he says the Congress is the oldest national political organization. After many battles, it has fought a non-violent way to freedom. And guess what he says after that? He says, it cannot be allowed to die. It can only die with the nation. So we have to read both these notes of his together, not just the first one. Nehru and Patel, we must remember, were behind the ban on the RSS Hindu Mahasabha after Gandhi's assassination, and they were very well aware, as I said, of the whole threat to their rule. Anderson is also very critical of Sardar Patel for what he says, Sardar Patel wanting RSS to join his party. This again, I think, is a complete distortion of Patel's position. I think again it's very important for us, as Bipin used to say, that, the standing in Kerala, I remember in Cannon many 30 years ago, he said that the left has to reclaim the legacy of the national movement. And I'd like to just take it forward and say that I think as secular historians, we have to lay claim to the secular part of the legacy of Sardar Patel, which I think is substantive. We cannot let Patel be appropriated by the Hindu communalists. In fact, Patel wholeheartedly went along with Nehru and was behind the banning of Mahasabha and RSS after Gandhi's assassination. This quote is very much taken out of context. I went back and looked at this quotation, and all that Patel had said was, there are many misguided youth in the RSS. I would appeal to them to come to the Congress, and we will try and reorient them towards national values. That is the exact quotation which Neerja Singh has given me from Patel Papers in Ahmedabad. He does not say, Anderson said, the Patel, I quote, wanted the RSS to join his party. This is a travesty. This is absolutely a wrong reading. The underlying ideological assumptions of such arguments, to conclude, are more problematic in a wider sense. If communalism and secular nationalism are collapsed, then the idea of India, of a pluralist, syncretic culture and society is dismissed. And community as constituted through violence, that's what Pandey would have us do, is offered as the only reality, then I'm afraid, friends, then only nihilism remains. Ideology is certainly the terrain on which historical debate is mounted. I would just crave your indulgence. What then is the kind of history that we might look forward to, or the kind of history that is being written, that one would like to see written? For one, very clearly, the history of those who stood out. That is, as Javed Alam said, has written, for every instance of killing that we hear of, we also hear of somebody's attempt to help, to rescue, somebody giving a shoulder to lean on. Some of the names are well known. Altaf Mia of Borishal, who gave his life to protect Hindus. Mahavir Tyagi, Dehradun congressman. Gandhi, who was called by Mountbatten a one-man boundary force. There were countless other stories. And there are so many oral history projects today, which many of us here are involved with also, which are doing this wonderful task. Secondly, this new kind of history would also go, I argue, beyond the limiting paradigm of the Holocaust to illumine the specificity of the Indian partition, in which lines between villains and victims were blurred. Unlike in the Holocaust, where it was clear who were the perpetrators and who were the victims. I earlier alluded to Veena Das in this respect. I believe here that Mahmood Mamdani's concept of popular genocide, which he has used to very good measure in his book on Rwanda, which the title of the book is When Victims Became Killers, that this concept might well be applied to understand what happened in the Indian partition. And it's not an accident that Mamdani has in fact himself referred to the Indian partition as a fit case of this kind of killing of neighbors and friends. This would also enable writing on partition to transcend the tropes of victimhood to underscore agency. Here I am referring to the writings particularly of the feminist scholars, particularly Butalia and others, which have been very useful, but I believe have created an entire victimology, which I think the phase for that is over. And I would welcome Gargi Chakravarti's book, Coming Out of Partition, Refugee Women of Bengal, for an alternative type of approach where the agency of the women is underscored rather than the victimhood. This is something that I believe needs to be done for other regions as well. The possibility of writing a different kind of history has opened up with the publication of the documents of the independence struggle in the Towards Freedom series. The Towards Freedom series, which under the stewardship of the eminent historians Gopal and Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, have made available a trove of historical sources. As the editor of the volume on 1947, the volumes that have been published, there are two which have already been published, and I hope the weight of the History Congress here should be behind the publication of the third one, which has been sitting with the press and with ICHR for 3 years, maybe waiting ministerial approval. So maybe if we throw our weight behind it, it may get published. But these 3 volumes, they cover a range of themes from political processes, aspirations of the state peoples, workers and peasant struggles, boundaries, refugees, economic consequences of partition, foreign relations, celebrations of 46, 47, and more. Many histories remain to be written which can be based on these documents. To conclude, India then, on the cusp of 70 years, is time enough to look at 1947 from a vantage point beyond the intertwined history of independence and partition. This is the perspective of transition, within which the churning as the new emerged from the old can be comprehended. The making of a new polity, economy and society involved both fashioning of new structures and restructuring old institutions. This paradigm of transition from colonial to post-independence is informed with a concern with issues of citizenship, aspirations for democracy, inclusion and discrimination, identity, gender, caste, and language, to name a few. This may help us move away from the jaded frameworks of continuity and change or transfer of power and better recognize what I believe was the revolutionary transformation marked by 15th August 1947. Thank you.